Hi, Sunil. Hi.
You hear me?
Yeah. So I couldn't hear you before. Yeah, okay, that's all right.
Start. So any issues from previous week? Hi everyone, good evening. Any issues from the previous week? You can open up your mic and say if you have anything. So how many of you completed the week 4 part without any issues? Okay. Do you guys have any issues with your database creation? Do you guys have any issues in week 4 or week 5? Just a second. Hello, is everyone there?
Yes, Sunil.
Okay, thanks for the response. So anyone having any issues with the database creation? I saw one particular issue where when you create your database, the schema was not created. If that's the case, you just run a command, create schema and the username, whatever user under which you're trying to create that database table. Yeah. From week 5, any issues with web services or JAS?
Hi, Sunil. Hi, sir.
Yes.
I have fixed the problem yesterday.
That's great.
Yeah, I removed the old one and I recreated. I basically used the clean library download from Moodle and just do everything again, and it works.
Your issue was you're not able to connect to the database. So when you create your JNDI name and a JNDI pool, you can ping your database and check.
Yes.
If that works good,
Yeah.
and your configurations work good, probably everything is okay.
Yes. So
Cool.
I've updated my studio work. Yes.
Cool. Nice.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So looking at some of the issues here, people are not able to start the Week 6 project. Look, when you created this, this is a workspace. The upper folder is the workspace. And when you create ng new Pokemon, this Pokemon is your Angular app. I'll probably discuss this in the later part of the lecture. So when you have created an Angular app, you need to be in that app in order to run the app. Okay. You don't need to be in some other directory above it to run it. There are some questions about customer contact. Can a customer contact code another customer contact? Well, why a customer contact need to do CRUD operation on another customer contact? It should be the staff or the sales agent which should be able to create a customer and should be able to create the customer contact. Okay, Guan has provided explanations. You can refer that. Generating tables from entities. All right, I generate tables from entities under JPA tool. I see that entities need some changes. However, after making changes, generating tables from entities, tables have not been updated. Look, I'm going to provide you a very easy solution for this. Okay, let me open my Eclipse. So there are multiple ways in which you can create your entity classes. You can either create your class and do the annotations correctly, and then what you can do is use the persistence.xml file to define the table generation strategy. So there is an attribute in the persistence.xml file, the table generation strategy. I'll just open and show it to you. Launch. So Eclipse has the persistence provider has few ways to do it, and so the valid options to provide as table generation strategy in persistence.xml is none, create tables, drop and create or extend tables. Likewise, currently you're just using create, but however, the easy strategy is to use create your database tables first, create the foreign keys, create the relations, create the sequencers, and then in your persistence.xml, you just say, I don't want any table generation strategy, none. Or if you want to create tables in the database from the entity classes, then you can provide here values as create table. Okay. So instead of none, you can provide create table. If you want to drop your old tables and create a new one, then you can use drop and create. Likewise. But my suggestion, my advice would be your development should be faster. What you can do is simply, let me open the database first. That's my terminal. Then just I want to bash shell, and then go to, let me check in my environment variable. Do I have Java home? Yes, I do have. Do I have Derby home? Yes, I do have. and then cd documents FID 5042, and then J library, and then DB derby cd DB derby DB minus derby bin /bin, and then sh start network server. So once Apache is starting, so I can connect to my database. I can have as many database I want. Okay, so this name is just the connection name, and this is the name of the database, and you should have a schema based on the name of your user. Okay, so to be able to ping that, yeah. Okay. Okay, there is no schema probably there. There should be some here. Okay, so based on the user, you should have your schema. If you don't have that schema, just create schema and the username. So what a good or what a tricky way or a smart way of doing is just go here, create the tables, create the relations, foreign keys and everything, and then instead of writing your entity classes, what you can do is right click, go to JPA tools, generate entities from tables. Basically, it's a reverse way where you have the tables and you're going to create the entities from the tables. So generate entities from the tables. It will ask you which connection. For me, the connection is FIT 5042DB, and under which schema, this specific schema, what tables you want to create an entity. So this and this sequence I don't want. These two I want to create. So next, it will tell what kind of relations you want to have. If you want to edit this, you can edit it, and then you can define entity access field or property where you want the annotations to be like. I'll always prefer property. Then you can specify the associated fetching strategy, eager, collection properties types is list or set based on what you need. You can change, once you generate this, you can change a little bit. That's still fine. And then go next, do all relations, and then finish. Now this is actually an easy way and a quicker way to create the entities. You guys can try it out. Okay. What else? Data dictionary for DB or DB data type. Okay, data dictionary basically will be like what are the different tables you're using and what attributes you're using and what are their data type. All right, so that should be data dictionary. Guan has provided inputs there. All right. Okay, let's get back to our topic today. Today's topic is Angular. It's very interesting. Before that, let me close my connections there and my Eclipse. All right, so this is week 6. So if you have already done your tutorials, which I think so, some of you have, you're provided with the exercise specification, which is the studio. So this is about creating a basic Angular app, doing the CRUD functionalities, and likewise, the objective is to learn how to build SPA. SPA is your single page applications using Angular framework. All code and everything is present here. So now, so it should open up the link. So you have your code in here, and there is this YouTube link that you can watch to build that. Even if you don't watch this, the same video is also provided to you in your lab demo section. So this consists of two parts. One is the Linux part and another is the Windows part. People who are using a Linux machine, they can watch this video or this video, they are same. And people using Windows, they can watch this. However, I strongly recommend you guys to watch both, because there is something to learn in here, and there is something to learn in here as well. In both different environments, there are subtle things you can always learn. So those will be very handy. That's one thing. Having said, this is a project folder under which package.json is there. So you need to be in this folder in order to do that npm serve command. Okay. Somebody has asked the same issue very early. Okay. So you need to be in this directory in order to run. Okay. The important files related to this project is package.json directly under the project folder. Package.json is basically like an import section of all dependencies, services that you need in order to run the project. It basically resolves all dependencies on external libraries and other modules that you need in order to run the project. So that's package.json. And then you have node modules. So whatever you update in package.json, those will be downloaded. Those will be downloaded into node modules. We'll see in the later part of the demo section, you'll see. And major part where all your codes are stored is SRC. Under SRC, the major is index.xhtm, which is actually displayed when you run the project. And then under app is what that is important. So under app, you have the main app module, which is like the entry to the app. So module basically bootstraps all different components into it. And then you have services and components. We'll learn as the lecture progresses what are services, what are components, what are modules, what are views, all those things. So for you guys, this path is important, and package.json in the parent directory is important. Okay. So if you haven't imported a required dependency or a module, you're not going to able to run the project successfully. All right. So you got plenty of video materials available to assist you in your development work. Cool. So everything is mentioned. So if you have seen, there is something where we do a check whether you got NPM or not. So NPM is Node Package Manager. So, first when you install Node.js, Node.js is basically built on, it is built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. And in order to create or resolve dependencies, you need a Node Package Manager that does that. So basically, whatever you do in package.json is actually running all these dependencies for the application to be able to execute on the Node.js. So your Angular app has 4 major components: the router, the modules, components, and services. And then there's an HTTP client library, okay, that interacts with your node part. All right. So how it happens is that is managed by Angular framework, and that is not our scope. But our scope is, so once you have the npm, you use the npm to install Angular. And once you install Angular, you should be able to run this command, ng-version, to see which version of Angular is installed. So for the node part, we recommend to use any LTS version, 10, 16, or 12, whatever. Just look for a long-term support LTS version, okay? Right, so that's the context. So when you have Angular installed, it comes with the basic modules, packages, and libraries, RxJX, schemas, core, and everything. So that's where you start with your project. Okay, we'll come to this project part in the later half. Let's start with the lecture. So these Angular applications, they're called a single page application. Anyone can tell me what do they understand by the term single page application? Please unmute yourself and say if you want to.
So there's just one single web page for the entire application.
Correct. So that's the thing. Just a single page and all the components inside that page that keeps getting updated over your routings and everything. All right. So that's why they're called as SPA clients. SPA client is what? Single page application clients. So before we go into further, I want to sincerely thanks Varun Poat, who has helped in creating and collecting the materials to create these specific lectures and lab materials. Sincere thanks to Varun, and also sincere thanks to Elliot and Pratik for the video assistance as well, and other teaching staff for pulling this out. Okay. So this week we are going to have an overview of client-side JavaScript framework. We'll introduce to Angular, its architecture, and an application example and demo. So in the market, there are a lot of JavaScript frameworks available, such as Angular, React, Vue. Angular is sponsored by Google, and React is sponsored by Facebook, and Vue, I don't know. But they are all based on TypeScript. Okay, TypeScript is kind of if you do search, it is an open source standard for writing JavaScript. So they have this file extension of TS. It's an open source programming language developed and maintained by Microsoft. It basically looks after the syntax superset of JavaScript. Okay. And Angular is one of the most popular front-end frameworks. However, there are contentions among developers if they want to prefer Angular or they want to prefer React. Okay. So both are very popular. Angular is a framework used to build a client-side application. It is written in TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript. The building blocks of Angular applications are ng modules, which provides compilation context for the components. All right. You can think of it as in terms of libraries, which provides the necessary functionalities for different components and services for different views to run. Okay, so and every app has one ng module. Okay, and then you have something called as components. So components have two major parts. One is the view, another is the class. So views are nothing but the templating. I won't say components. Components are like, so when you see a single page, the parts of the page are actually the components view, which is displayed. So these are basically the views or the screen elements in the Spark client. And then you have services. So services are the reusable parts which provides additional functionality to power the view. It provides the backend logic of the view, what view to contain. So they are basically reusable components, and they are injected into components at runtime. So if you want to do some function or something, you call a service. So that's how services work. And then you have a very powerful feature called a router. So router is a special module service where you basically use to navigate to different paths. Okay. So in components, you have two kinds of components. Generally, components can be considered as two types. One is the root app component, and others are the created components. So the root app component is app component. So when you create an ng app name, app app.module.ts is created, app.component.ts is created. That app.component.ts, that's the root app component. I'll probably keep my editor open to show you what I'm saying. WebStorm. So in terms of Angular architecture, both components and services are classes, which has decorators that mark their type. We'll see what they are once my WebStorm loads up. Okay. So here you see, I don't have a project. My project itself is Pokemon. So here you see in your terminal, this is my terminal, it's fine. So when I create a new project, right, ng new some Angular name, it creates this structure for me where you have the package.json, where all the required dependencies are set. And then by default, under the app section, under the app component, you'll have app component.ts and app component.html. So when you create the app, the root app component is created. Okay. And this is one kind of component. All right. And then you have your own created component using ng-gc, is Angular generate components, such as ng-gc component name. This is manually created component name. Okay. So other components, if you see, these are normal, other type of normal components. This is app root component. So when you do ng-gc component name, it usually creates 4 files. All right. One is the view, which is having .html, and the model behind that view, which is which have the file extension .ts. So that's the model, that's the view. This is for any types, any kind of CSS on the selector CSS. And this is for testing purposes, not in our scope. So main area to focus is this 2 part of components. Okay. So let's look at the architecture diagram. So this is Angular architecture. Here you have services, and here you have components. So in the components, you have 2 parts. The one is the template view, which is .html. Another is the component model, is component.ts. So let's not call it as component model. Let's just call this as component, and this is component view. Simple. Okay. So any attributes that are present in the component class can be displayed over in the view. using property binding. So that's one way. And again, if you have any kind of event selectors on the template, such as on click, on change, things like that, that can be event binded to call a function or to update an attribute inside component. So if you open this component.ts, it's actually a class. No? So components are classes, and they have the decorator, Angular decorator @component. This is the selector for CSS. This is a template URL where the view is stored. This is the style URLs for the CSS. So in here, if a component need to call a service or want to run a function, it basically subscribes to a service, and service has the thing called as observables, which provides the context for running the service. We'll learn about in detail what are those in the coming slides. So this is this is basically the architecture. So you have components, service, functions, and ng directives. So metadata of a component has two parts. One is the template URL, and in this URL, in the template, sorry, not template URL, in the template view, you have Angular directives and Angular bindings. These bindings are basically to call the properties, attributes, or functions of a component class. So if you see how it's done, property binding, it's done through a binding markup of two curly braces, which looks like this. So just like in your JSF, you had this expression language to bind into the model managed bean. Similarly, in JSF, similar to that of JSF side, you have something called as binding markup, which is represented as double curly braces, which is used to bind the attribute or the properties of the component class. Okay. I hope that makes a understanding. So just like in your JSF, which is actually an MVC architecture, for the Spark lines, generally the architecture is MVVM. It's model to view, view to model. So if you have an attribute on the model using property binding, you can display it on the view. And if you want to call something based on event or a function, from the view, you can call that through event binding, again back to the model. So model to view, view to model. So there is no controller here. The concept of controller is not there because you're always in the same page. It's always the same page. It's a single page application, right? So you might be thinking, so I don't have a faces servlet. I don't have that. So how do the navigation things work? So who does all those things? So there is a special module for that, and that is routing module. So the routing module takes care of all your navigation. It defines all your navigation path and tells you where to move based on what path. Okay, so which component to be displayed based on what path is determined by the routing module. So basically you can think of it as this is the controller, but there is no controller because you are always on the same page. The component that changes is determined by the path, and who takes care of that? The routing module. Okay. So in the app module, you have dependencies on browser module, routing module, and other modules, and in-memory web module. This in-memory web module will talk about it because this is basically comes from in-memory web API to mock an API resource service for a mock database thing. I will show you when I run the project. All right, and then you have reactive forms modules and form module. Okay, so you can see where the paths are based on here. All right. So this is your MVVM architecture with the routing provides which component to be displayed based on what path. And in the app modules, you have the dependency on a routing module. And in the routing module, so if anything is a module, right, you'll have that ng directive of ng module. If it is a component, you'll have that ng directive @ component. So these are the Angular directives to specify what is that. Okay. So similarly, if it is a service, you'll have some other kind of if it is a service, you'll have some other kind of directives. All right. So this is your single page application architecture. Okay, we started with the ng modules. So sorry, we were talking a bit on the path, right? So on the router path side, based on the path here on the URL, which specific component view to be rendered is determined here. All right, let's go to the next slide. So ng modules. These are the container for a cohesive block of code dedicated to an application functionality. It contains components and service provider, provides components and different service provider. So if you have any dependencies on any other services, you basically put it here. So providers are the services, those are to be used in your component or in your module. So this module doesn't have any dependency on any external service, any other service. So this is empty. Okay. So you can have use services inside modules, and you can use your services inside components. So for this specific module, you don't have any dependency on any services. So provider is empty. So it contains declarations of components and imports of different functionalities and modules. Okay. It can export import functionality from other ng modules. So if you have another ng app inside the ng app, so you will have another ng module. So if you want to use that as a reusable component, basically it increases the complexity of the app, but you can import it here. Okay, import it here. So basically we're using the browser modules and other modules here, right? So this is how I import different functionality like predefined service modules. Every Angular application will have at least one ng module the root ng module. Okay, so this is our ng module. Ng module is defined by a class decorated with @ng module. So @ng module is the class decorator metadata that says this is an ng module. Okay. So ng module metadata, it has declarations, export imports, providers, and bootstrap. Okay. A very major part, your application is actually bootstrapped from an ng module. And bootstrap means how can I explain is that that provides an entry into the main program through bootstrapping. Okay, so the app has the app has that ng module that bootstraps to start. So whatever is bootstrapped, that specific component will be first displayed. Okay, we'll see when things will progress. So these are a few metadata. So 1 metadata, 2 metadata, 3 metadata, 4 metadata. Okay. So there can be questions like give some examples of ng module metadata and you know what they are. So this is how ng modules look like. We just went through that. Sample module definition, we were just comparing it by and by. Okay. I was talking to you about the same thing, like the root module, right? So the root module bootstrap the app root component. Okay. When it bootstrap the app root component, so this app component is the root component, right? App root component. It refers to this. So when you highlight app component, this app component is in the same directory where this file is. This specific is app component. So you have this as the app component. Okay. So this is the app component model and this is the app component view. Okay. So this is the model. This is the view. This is for the test. This is for CSS, which is not interested at the moment. Okay, so in any ng module, only root module has the root ng app, and the normal components will not have the ng module. So this is an example of the normal component I was talking to you about a lot. So they will not have the ng module, where the root app component will have the ng module, because that provides the entry point. So root component has in the ng module you have multiple components. So in your ng module root component, you have listed out what are the different components you're using. Everything is listed there. So we can have different modules inside root module, which we just saw. And yeah, so that's the module component structure. So components are the classes that interacts with HTML page. And I was saying you components and service, both are classes. So if you open up a component, that's a class. If you open up a service, that's also a class. However, how do you identify that's a component? You'll have that ng directive at the red component. So a component class will be the is like the model, and component.html is the view. So when we actually call components, we basically refer to the classes that interacts with the HTML view or the template view. This is the structure of component. For any component, you'll have these 4 things. I'm probably being rhetoric here, but this is for your understanding. You'll have the view, template view that has the extension of .html, .css or .scss based on what you select when you create a component. And then you have spec.ts for test classes, and component.ts contains the logic backing the view. Okay, and only the special root app module, root app component will have this extra in its extra file app module.ts, the component module. This actually registers the component in a module. So here we were saying all the components those are used in the project is actually registered in your app module.ts. So individually you can instead of doing ng-gc component, which basically stands for Angular generate components, if you manually create these file structures and everything, that is still okay, that's still fine. But in that case, you need to put your class name declared in the app module.ts, because that's where you need to register what are the different components you are using in the module. So if you see in the ng module, you have all components listed here, including the root component. Okay, you have component 1, 2, 3 and the root component. Everything is listed in the ng module, that is app module.ts. So how do you define a component? We'll always keep a example open. So the components have a selector for ng app. This is for any styles. And then you have template URL, which contains where the view of that component is. And then providers have a list of all services that the component is going to inject and make use of it. So services are the reusable parts, right? Reusable functions and everything. So if I want to make use of it, I'll simply provide it as my dependency. So here in Pokemon Crowd component.ts, I don't have any providers here, but I will be okay, but it's all imported, that's fine. So this is an example of component definition. And this is what you see next to it is Pokemon components. So selector is in CSS selector that tells Angular to inject component wherever it finds the selector. Template URL references the component HTML template to render. Providers provides an array of services that the component requires to work properly. So this is view syntax. So template view syntax. Who can tell me what is double curly braces here?
It is similar to what we use in JSF to bind the Java code, the same way we do it over here.
Yeah, in JSF you call it as expression language. In Angular you call it as a binding markup. Yeah, it is string interpolation, which we will study in the few slides next, as Harsha mentioned. So here if you see ng for is an ng directive for the for loop. All right, and binding markup of double curly braces basically marks up attributes inside poke, the attributes inside it to display it here. So this is how you write an for loop in Angular view. Okay, so Pokemons is an array list, and you're telling Angular to loop through the array and render the list. Okay, so typescripting way, Angular way of looping is *ng. TypeScript Angular way of looping is type ng for. Okay, just remember. All right, so that view is displayed. And then how do we do data binding in Angular? Okay, so there are 4 different ways. One is string interpolation, another is property binding and event binding, and the last one is two-way binding. So these 3, so this data binding is basically between the component and the view. Okay, data binding is between component and the view. So there are 4 types of data binding: string interpolation, property binding, and event binding, and two-way data binding. So these 3 binding that I have highlighted, these are all a one-way binding. Okay, either model to the view or view to the model. They're not two-way binding. Whereas we have another approach called two-way binding. Even in two-way binding, there are different ways in which you do two-way binding. We'll look at that in the later stage. But let's look at what is all these kind of data bindings are. So data binding in Angular is string interpolation. So the one-way data binding, it's a one-way data binding. Here, the text is an attribute of so do we have anything called as this dot somewhere here? No, it's not in here. Let me check here. Okay, there is no this dot here. Check here. Okay, if you have any this dot an attribute, basically this is a string interpolation. So whatever value that you have set on the attribute in the model class will be displayed. And then you have property binding. So property binding is little different from the string interpolation. String interpolation is the most convenient or an easy way. Okay, I should have something. Okay, here. All right. So you see here the title in app component.html. So this title is actually an attribute from the Angular class. So that is app component model class. So the value that will be displayed when I run to this page will be in the view here on the title. I should see in big headers Pokemon app. Okay, so this is an example of string interpolation. And then you have property binding. So property binding is updating the value of a variable in the component and displaying it in the view. This is also one-way data binding. So what happens is that so let me open up a view. So this is an HTML tag. This is an HTML tag. It doesn't have much thing. Okay, this is an HTML tag. Okay. Let me just write here something. So if I have an HTML tag that is like display an image, the image source image src is equal to some path, okay, xyz slash abc dot jpg. Okay, if that's the source of my image, and I can have other properties like class is equal to img something, size equals size is equals to 20, height 20, whatever. So when you have an HTML element like this, sorry for my typo. So when you have an HTML element like this, these are the properties of the attributes of that HTML elements, and these are the properties of those attributes, or the values of those attributes of the HTML elements. So this values, if you want to update of an HTML element, you can do it using property binding. So the example here is, instead of providing a fixed path, what you have to do is just give it a variable called path name, and put the HTML property under square brackets, and in your class define that attribute, and in your class, so this is PokemonCrowd.html. So I go to PokemonCrowd.component, which is my class. In this class, I define path name as type string, and the value as your coming from same folder, XYZ folder under the same directory, and the name of the file is abc.jpg. Okay. So this is JavaScript way of doing declaring variables. So this is the name of the variable, this is the data type of the variable, and this is the value of the variable. Okay, that's a very common question. If you're going for an interview, they will ask, what's the difference between equals to, and equals to. So the first equals to, anyone wants to speak about it? Has any idea? All right, the first equals to is basically an assignment. Okay, the second equals to is basically comparing two values, and the third equals to is comparing the values plus the data type. So in JavaScript, if you don't provide any data type, by default, even if you provide a number or anything, that is taken as a string object. Okay, in your heap, in the JavaScript heap, it will be in the heap memory, it will be a string object. So that's the difference. Okay, let's not go into detail. So I hope you understood the difference between string interpolation and property binding. Property binding is of the HTML tags. If you want to update the property, you use it this way. Okay, on init is basically a lifecycle method, which is called when the constructor is first initialized. So just remember, SRC has to be in the square brackets, and the path is the value. So I just gave you an example. I'm going to remove this and remove this as well. Okay. So the third type of binding is event binding. So event binding is something that happens based on an event, and the event happens where? Where does the event happens? So the event happens on the view or the model?
It happens in the view.
Right. So when there is an event, examples are like on click, on change, things like that. It will trigger that method in a component. So that is from the view to model. And string interpolation and property binding is from the model to view. This is from the view to model. Okay. So what it does, it updates or send the value of a variable from the presentation layer to the model. Okay. This is one-way data binding. And you can see an example here. You have a button when you which displays a text from the, which is an attribute from the model class. And when you click, the specific function is called. So you registered the events here, and you call the functions based on the events being called on the elements. Okay, so here on click of the button, the document object model, the DOM event, will be executed by Angular. So you can provide your own custom logic to execute in click.me, and whatever will happen in click.me will update the value here, and it will be redisplayed back. This is similar to listener event in JSF. The difference is JSF requests have to go all the way to server, but here everything happens on the client side. So we had covered these three types of binding: string, property, and event. We'll take a short break. It's 7:10. Let's come back at 7:20. Okay. I'll give you 10 minutes break. Let's resume at 7:20. Okay. All right. Welcome, guys. The short break. Okay. So we were about to learn the two-way data binding, right? So two-way data binding is a combination of both event and property binding. It's a continuous synchronization of data between the view and the model. And you can use ng model property on the elements to achieve this. Okay. So how to do two-way data binding is to use square bracket and open parenthesis, then close parenthesis and closing square brackets. So you use ng model property to use two-way data binding. So this binding uses this notation, right, of square bracket and open parenthesis, closing parenthesis, and This is called as banana notation. Okay, this is a templating way of passing parameters. I was telling you, right, in two-way data binding, we have two ways of doing two-way data binding. So one way is using banana notation on ng model, that is called as templating way of passing parameters between view and the model. And the second is your reactive way, which we'll learn a little later. So when you use ng model on a banana notation, this value here, this Pokemon, is actually the attribute from the component class. So wherever you have binding, view binding, string interpolation of Pokemon in your view, whatever value that you pass in your input will be displayed dynamically on the view. This is a very simple use case. You can try it out. Okay. So whatever you type in the input box, the same thing will be displayed in the view. This is because there is a two-way data binding. Whatever you are writing on the view is actually being set on the model, and whatever is set on the model is again being displayed on the view. So if the user updates the input box, the updated value is received in the component and is displayed back to the user in real time. Okay. So this is templating way of passing parameters between the view and the model. The second one, which we are going to use, is which we have actually used, is a reactive way. What? I don't have that slides. Okay, it is there here. Using the form parameters. All right, it's there here. All right, we missed out on. Okay, I will come back later there. So the second way is the reactive way, which is little different, but this is more scalable and it is very robust. Okay, so it uses form capture. The user input events from the view. It validates the user input and create form model and the data model to update. It provides a track to change to the form model. So instead of template driven forms where you have this banana notation to bind the property from the view to model, model to view, if you're using the reactive forms, you just have to declare a form group and the name that you want to use in the component class as a form control. So these are more robust, scalable, and testable. These goes well with reactive programming, and the reactive forms are asynchronous. Here, the form control name matches the form group. Okay. Form control name matches the form group. That's fine. So let me open up this one. So if you see these two lines here, these are two input text areas, right? So here the form control name is name. So this name and power is actually either you could have used the banana notation where you could have used ng model with name and power. Okay, but we are using here best or a more advanced manner of using reactive forms, where we are using form control names. This form control name and power is basically is this attributes of the Pokemon form group. Okay. So this is a name and power reflects to these form control name and power. So this is a bit scalable. It's much more performant and things like that. Here we are initializing the reactive form with an empty value and fetching Pokemon data from service. So it's describing about this method. Okay. But if you see here, when it is initialized in the component.ts, when these attributes on the component, they get initialized, it basically has empty values. So when I run, so if I do ng serve, so basically when you run and see, initially it will have empty values there. It's not take this long. Yeah, select this and run. I don't know, my laptop is super slow. All right, and then we were talking about this RxJS library. This is to deal data in Angular, the asynchronous ways of communication. This is easy to make asynchronous and callback based code. Okay, before I go to this observables part, let me quickly have a look into the component lifecycle hooks. So the lifecycle methods are generally called during the lifecycle of a component. Basically, when you request for a component through the routing module, your component lifecycle starts. So every component in Angular has lifecycle hooks managed by Angular. The lifecycle hooks are used by the developers to react to the changes when Angular creates, renders, checks, and destroys the component. All right. So you can load the data from services into ng on init lifecycle hook. And if something changes, you can use ng on change and things like that. So these are a few lifecycle hooks available. Let's see. A bit of things about ng on init. This is an important lifecycle hook because this is invoked when a component is first initialized. And then ng on destroy, this performs all the cleanup before the component is destroyed, changes and things like that. So this is very simple and similar. Okay, this part, observables. So there are two things here. One is called as observables, and so let me find out where is that. So generally, observables would be there in the service class because services are the reusable component. These are the service resources part, which is more like the publisher. So it publishes the web resources, and subscriber is the one which hooked to this publisher to get some data out of it. So you use subscribers in the component in order to call the services. And the services are services have those publishers, and these publishers are called as observables. So these observables are used to accommodate the data and the type received in streams between the publishers and the subscribers. So subscriber is like a client, all right, that hooks onto the web resource. So subscribers are present in components, and publishers or the observables are which are like web resources, they are present in services. And observables is the way in which you can accommodate the data and the type received in streams. Okay, so this is used for passing messages between publishers and subscribers. It's for asynchronous programming. Use subscribe method to execute the observable. So subscribe is in components. When you call subscribe, it basically calls the method observable. So this method observable would be there in which class? Which class? So publishers are like observables that sit in the services, and subscriber are like clients that sits in components. So subscriber, they call a hook to the publisher. So whenever you call subscribe to a method, the observable will get execute. So whenever you call subscribe in an component class, so this is how the dependency injection of services happen. Okay, so when you call the subscribe in a component class, there is a dependency injection where the client calls asynchronously the observable method, observable resource published in your service class. Does that make sense? So you can use unsubscribe method to stop receiving events from the observable. Observable emits value when subscribed. So publisher is in service class, subscriber is in the component. The services is injected into the component and it is invoked asynchronously when you try to subscribe to the observable. So this is your, can you tell me this is which class? You're subscribing here. So this is which class? Components or services? So if you have a method that subscribes, that means this method is present in component class. So when you subscribe, the relative method, the same method which is present in the service, it does a dependency injection and calls that method in the service class. Same method will be called in the service class. And because it is observable, it accommodates the asynchronous data transfer between the publisher, which is this method, and the subscriber, which is the one which is calling from the component. Okay. And for commonly used Angular HTTP methods, you know this by now. Get, post, delete, put. Get is to select, create, get all objects. Post is to create objects. Delete is to remove objects. Put is to update an object. Okay. So in Angular, HTTP is provided by the HTTP client library. It is injected as a service. So you see, it is injected as a service. This is just an object of type HTTP. So you can use different methods of what type you want to return and what is invoked. This API.url, this part is invoked and return. So we use HTTP client library to make requests to the server, the Angular server. Angular framework is within the node server. So whenever you make an HTTP client request, once the request is formed, it calls the node server. So that part you don't need to understand because that is outside Angular framework, but you need to understand the framework and the construct, what is component, what is services, and different template views, what is template classes, component classes, what is root component, what is normal component, what is app module, what is a routing module, how navigation is done in Angular. Those things you need to understand in order to build an app. So these are the functions which are called. So you are trying to post data type Pokemon to this specific URL, and this is the object that you are passing, and these are like the HTTP options. The HTTP options are like the headers. That is basically telling what is the data that you're trying to send. Is it an application JSON or a form URL encoded and things like that? Basically the meme type. You can see here, this is headers. Okay. So this is how you do put. So if you see, get is what you return from hitting this URL. Post is you're posting to this URL of a data Pokemon of type Pokemon with this application JSON as a header types. And then put is also you are again hitting this URL by passing an object, which is this of type this. And then delete is you're trying to remove a specific object from this URL. So it makes an HTTP delete operation using the client library. So routing. So this is an important part I need to cover. So as we discussed in the previous part of the lecture, routing is that specific part which is like a controller, but there is no page navigations. It's only the component updation. So you don't have a controller. What you have is actually a router which looks at the routing path and determines which component to be displayed in the same page. Where that components to be displayed, we'll see. I'll quickly jump into the demo. So another important thing that you need to understand is path is the URL. So the path is the URL, and based on that path, which component to be invoked or which component to be displayed in the browser. When I call component, component has two parts. What is that? What are the two parts of the component? You can put it in the chat box or unmute and speak. What are the two parts of the component? Are you guys listening? One is the view, other is the model. This is a template view, this is the template model, sorry, component model. So the router link property is to navigate to different components. So you will see router link, and we are using button to navigate to different pages in our example. The router outlet is the tag which tells Angular where to render the component pages. So in your app component.html, you have the router component part, which so based on the path which is selected, the component view will be replaced here. So this tag tells where to render the pages. So if you want to keep the router outlet on the top, your page component view will be displayed above. Okay. All right. So Angular routing, this is to get the form parameters, where you define parameter based on what you define parameters. So detail component, right? So in detail component, based on the parameters that you define, you need to get that parameter here. So where you define that parameter is in the client URL. You call this from the list. This is the URL that you hit. Okay, let me quickly jump into the demonstration part. So we'll see. So once you do ng-serve or you run the Angular client server, you should be able to see where your app client is hosted. You click on it, you'll be taken to localhost 4200. So I just this here. So when I try to invoke, what I'm trying to do is I'm looking at the root path, and / represents the root path. So when I'm here, I have 3 buttons. So what happens first is under the project directory, there is something called as index.html. So index.html is actually displayed here. And because you have something like app root here, so whatever present in the app component view will be replaced here. Okay, so this is my app component view. So this part of the code will be copied and replaced in this part of the code. Okay, so this is what happens. Okay, so that's why you will see the title. So when this component view is created, that specific component model lifecycle will kick off. So the model behind this is this. So once this, not this, this. So once this gets kick off, you have an attribute called title, which has Pokemon app, and you have a router in your constructor. So what happens here is, where is my view? I don't like so many things. Okay, so what happens here is, instead of title, there is string interpolation, and the value that is displayed is Pokemon app. Does it make sense? look, when I copied this and saved, it automatically did a refresh of the page. So I need to remove this because this is automatically done by Angular. So I'll save this again, it will compile and it will render this back. You see, this is processing. So because I don't have that app thing, I don't see anything here. No component is rendered. So I need to have app root. Now everything will be good. So every time I save it is on ngserve, it gets automatically deployed. Okay, so that's how it is. So when I go to CRUD app, okay, what happens? So this specific view is replaced in this part. So initially under index.html, this part is replaced by this part. Okay, this part, this root app component, this part, the one which I'm highlighting. So this part have something called as router outlet, right? So we just now a few minutes back, we just discussed what happens in router outlet is, this is a tag which tells Angular where to render the page. So look, this is how it is a single page, but based on different path, you have different content. Okay, so this is managed by something called as router. So when why it happens is, module app module is my way for the main program. So main program is the entry to a program. So the app root module is my entry to the program. So it says initially in the index.html app root, what you have to display. So index module say, look, I have bootstrapped this app component. Okay, this app component is this. So you need to display in app root of index.html the app component. That's why you have app component view displayed in index.xhtml. You can always do a right click. So if I'm the home or the root, you can always do right click and page source and see the content looks similar to that of index.xhtml, and then the app root part being changed with the app component view. This is the app component view. You see the three buttons, because these are the three buttons: home, CRUD app, and Poke API. Okay, so when I look here, you see when I look for CRUD API, the path changed. Okay, the path changed, the router path changed. The router link is CRUD API, CRUD app. So it will go to the routing module and look for the path called CRUD app. After root, the path called CRUD app, and which component to be displayed. Now it is not app path, app root. This is, instead of app root, in the app root you have a router outlet in the app view. Now when a normal component is selected, which is being provided by the router module, this router outlet will be updated. So this part of the code which is present in index.xhtml will be updated with the component Pokemon CRUD component. So this is the Pokemon CRUD component. So if you highlight this is Pokemon CRUD component. So it gets this component, Pokemon CRUD component view. So this is the view that is copied and replaced in the app component router outlet. That's why when you see an app component thing here, and where you have the router outlet, in the bottom. So if you move this router outlet to above, you will see this view moves above. So did you guys understand how single page application works? Basically replacing the router outlet component. Good. Now what happens? You have gone into that view. So when you go into that view, that specific model lifecycle starts. Okay. So the lifecycle says the template URL that has to be rendered is Pokemon crowd component.html, which is this. And these are the CSS component styles things, blah, blah thing. And then you have a few attributes, which is being set here. And there is an attribute called Pokemons, which is of type Pokemon data service. So if you click on Pokemon data service, it is coming from data Pokemon data service. So in your app structure, there is something called as data. Data is basically a mock data source, which is an in-memory web API, and it uses a mock URL called API Pokemons, API/Pokemons, in order to hit this in-memory DB service. Okay. So what happens first is, how did I change this? Okay, I copied the things multiple times. So first is you declare the form group because we are doing it in a reactive way. So in your component, when it gets installed, so you have a form group. So this is of data type form group. And this form group, on the initialization of this specific class, has two different attributes called name and power of type form control created. So in your view, you have two attributes, name and power, created for these two input text boxes. So by default, when you don't enter anything, you see enter name. This is because of the placeholder values here. So if I change it to enter XYZ, it will be showing XYZ. So whatever value you enter is done two-way binding into the name attribute of the class here. Okay. So this is how this is set. Now let's look at what happens when this class lifecycle starts. The constructor is called Pokemon data service. So Pokemon data service is of type data service. Okay, don't get confused with the names. This is a variable. This is the data type. I told you repeatedly. The first part is a variable or attribute. The second part is data type, and the third is the value. Okay, so Pokemons is the attribute, and Pokemon data service is the data type, and this is the value, empty array list. So data service is actually the name of the service class called data service. You see? How do you know that? So when you're here, when you click, it will show here. This data service is of service data service. All right, that's how I know which class. So it refers data service, it injects data service object, and then just assign this Poke variable to a new Pokemon. Okay, and in the ng-init lifecycle hook form group, which was defined in your thing that got done, we just covered this, and then this method is called get Pokemons. So when this specific method get Pokemons is called, it will call this Pokemons here. So in this Pokemon, you're calling the data service. This class service class method get Pokemons. Can you tell me why? Because you're subscribing, you are inside a component, you are subscribing a hook into the service class method get Pokemons, and whatever data is asynchronously sent is being set onto this variable, okay, using this specific notation. Whatever is set is whatever you get by calling the data service get Pokemon will be asynchronously set into this variable data. And now this Pokemon values, this array list will be set with this specific value here. Okay, so let's go back to the service where the published or the observable method is called based on this subscribe. So we go to the service and get Pokemon's observable Pokemon data service is called. So return this HTTP. So HTTP is a HTTP client library, and it is calling this API URL. So this is the API URL. I told you this API URL basically mocks an API database resource. So when you say API Pokemons, URL is called in the HTTP request by the HTTP client library, a Pokemon data service. Here the Pokemon data service array type is returned. So when you hit this API, which is from the data, you see this Pokemon data service is from the data, right? So you go to the data service, Pokemon data service, and when this is called, it returns the Pokemons, and this Pokemons is of type array of Pokemons, which consists of array of dictionaries, which has attributes of ID, name, and power. Okay, and how this Pokemon array is defined, this Pokemon data type is defined in the model Pokemon.ts, where you define Pokemon has these 3 attributes. Okay, and then these are this is like mocking the database service. Okay, this is in-memory DB service. There's no real DB in there. So when it returns this in the data service get Pokemon, it will return me that list of 10 different Pokemons. So once it returns that 10 different Pokemons in your observable, where it will be sent back asynchronously, it will be sent back to the subscriber, and the subscriber was in the component model. Component model get Pokemons here. So this data will have an array of dictionaries of 10 different Pokemons, and now this Pokemons will be set with it was earlier empty. Now it will have that array list, that array of Pokemons. Now this Pokemon variable or the attribute has that 10 different list. Let's go to that. Now your life cycle has finished on the model side. Let's look at the thing here. So this attribute is set, this attribute is set. You have the 2 buttons, update clear, and here you go. So here the Pokemons now have 10 different Pokemons. This is an array of 10 different Pokemons. This is an angular way of looping at it. So each Pokemon inside that has the ID, name, and power. So it loops through each of those objects and displays you this values, ID, name, and the power. Along with that, it also displays you two different buttons, update, delete, likewise here. All right. So this is your one functionality. And the second one is Poke API. So Poke API is, it hits Pokemon path. So when you hit Pokemon path in the routing module, when the path is Pokemon, it calls Pokemon list component, correct? So Pokemon list component is this component under Poke API directory. So it tells you it's under Poke API Pokemon list. This is the component where you which you need to display the value. So when it goes to the component, it has these few attributes, and it has on init life cycle that gets some the ID attribute and sets it. So here on the detail list, I wanted to show you one thing. On the detail list, it's Pokemons, but when I click here, you can see down below this this part. It's hitting Pokemon API. Okay, so when I hit Pokemon API, my URL will change to Pokemon, and then this ID is that placeholder. Okay, so if I pass here Sunil as the variable, in that case, in the Pokemon detail component, I need to get the form parameter, the path parameter, not ID, but Sunil, because that will have that number 1, 2, 3, whatever. I'll just undo. Detail component. Okay. Now, what happens here is when you see Pokemons, list out Pokemons, right? Pokemon.ts. So it basically on init, it calls this specific URL. Okay. So when it calls this URL, this URL is a web service, an external web service. Let me open up my Postman. I'll take 5, 6 more minutes. So just hang on there. I think I saved something. I hope my app is not changed. Okay, that's fine. So when Pokemon is called, Pokemon list module model is called. When this model is called, you see it has an attribute called Pokemons, which is of data type any, and it has an HTTP attribute of type HTTP client library, and it makes a GET request to this URL. So let me copy this URL and let me put this in a GET request. So you will see this returns me a list of top 20 Pokemons. Okay, it says there are 1050 Pokemons, and the result has an offset of and the limit of 20. So it sends me a dictionary or a JSON with an key called results that has an array of dictionaries, with each dictionary or each JSON with a value called name and URL. So that's why when I hit this URL, the whatever data is received is this JSON. This JSON. From that JSON, it finds out the result key. So it finds out the result key from the data and assigns to these Pokemons. All right. Now this Pokemons is displayed in the view. So in the view, it loops through each of those arrays of dictionaries and it loops through each of arrays of these dictionaries which were set on the Pokemons, and Poke is now this much. Okay, so for each Poke of Pokemons, it gets a name attribute, which is Bulbasaur, and in the router link, it says the path that you need to navigate is Pokemon, and it passes the ID, which is index +1, because initially it starts from a 0th, and then it passes the poke.url. So when you click on this specific path, in this specific path, you see down below, here you get the list of top 20 Pokemons based on what is fetched in Pokemon's view. Now, when you click on one of these, you will be navigated to Pokemon/1. Okay. It takes some time to load because this is asynchronous, unless I have changed something in the view or the component. I hope I haven't. I think I did change something because it recompiled. So, so when this path is called, okay, I'm passing the parameter as Sunil and getting there as an ID. So when this path is called Pokemon, and this is just a variable name. So I'm passing Sunil, it should be ID, but if I'm passing Sunil here, in the Pokemon detail components, I should be getting the path parameter, which is a variable here. This variable name is Sunil now. So I should get Sunil and then say, so this will be auto deployed, redeploy. Look, now I get the values. So it will hit this URL and the value that was fetched here for the Sunil variable set into the ID, and it will append that request and it will make another GET request. I hope I had explained everything here. It's just that I hope you have an understanding. If you have any other further questions, you can ask, or you can just revisit the videos that were provided by Elliot and Pratik to create your own project. One last thing that I want to say before I close the session. You see the project folders here, it should not have any kind of lock sign. So you should be creating your project as a root or an administrator. And in Windows, you should not create your project under program files. You should create in a directory where you don't need special permissions to make changes, because you need to run this as a root. All right, any other questions? All right, thank you very much. Have a good evening.